Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Ostler. On the podcast today in my home is Drew Young. Welcome to the podcast, Drew.
Thanks for having me.
Drew has been on the podcast two other times. He's an LDS author, married father of one. Episode 276 is his story as an early release missionary, and a book that he wrote about that. And episode 325 are thoughts about solving porn use. So Drew is somebody that has been willing to talk and continues to talk about more tender subjects in LDS culture that need to be talked about. And so he has written a second book called, why don't you tell our listeners the name of your second book?
Stand Guard at the Door of Your Mind is what it's called. It's a mouthful.
And tell our listeners more about the timing of that book, if they can pre-order it now, when the release is.
Yeah. So it's on Amazon for pre-order. It's really my, when I was going through some dark times emotionally and spiritually and mentally, it was kind of my way to feed my soul. All the things in the book are things that I had researched, things from my journals, things that I learned from different motivational speakers and different authors and things like that. And I wrote it all down and added my personal experience to it to help people with cultural dilemmas concerning pornography, mental health, suicide, bullying, and just trying to do my part to help rid the world of those things.
And that's great. So I encourage our listeners to order that book. It's at Amazon. I believe the official release date is August 10th. And why don't you, before you get in these topics, for anybody that hasn't listened to your earlier podcast, just introduce yourself to us, your age, where you grew up, and just a little bit of your life story.
Sure. So I'm 25 years old, currently live in Sandy, Utah with my wife and daughter, as you mentioned, and grew up in Connecticut, loved it, moved to Utah when I was 12, have been in Utah ever since. And as you mentioned, a big part of my story was kind of learning how to manage my life after coming home early from missionary service due to mental health issues. And yeah, it's been a wonderful journey to try and figure out how I can add my voice and my experience to those who are struggling.
And as we learned in other episodes, you went through some really difficult times.
Yeah.
In high school and coming home from your mission. And instead of just kind of locking those up in your life and moving forward, you've been one of these courageous people that is willing to talk about being bullied, coming home early, some of these other topics of your new book.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you do that, because I think there's right now listeners just need somebody that's sort of been in their space and can give them hope they can pull out of that space and there's better days. And as we talk on this podcast a lot, a minister service, is authentic if, he or she can lead someone out of the desert. I'm paraphrasing this quote, listeners, that I've done a better job in the past, but it's basically the idea that Drew knows these deserts. And it sometimes takes someone that knows the deserts that he's going to talk about that can authentically lead other people out of them. It's one of the reasons I'm drawn to Elder Holland with his Broken Vessel talk, when he vulnerably talked about his own mental health at times, and it just made me love and respect him even more. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, tell us more, just wherever you want to go. You could outline the chapters. You could go deep dive right now into one of the chapters, just wherever the Spirit's kind of telling you to go, Drew.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Well, as I mentioned, kind of the premise of the book covers different topics that our culture, our society kind of struggles with. Whether we ourselves struggle with it or we know someone that does, it's universal in application concerning what we have challenges towards in our lives. And as I mentioned, I grew up in Connecticut. I the youngest of 8 kids, and my dad got a job when I was 4 years old that moved, the family out to Connecticut and from Utah. And so that's kind of where my story begins. I kind of paraphrase it when I tell people I have kind of 2 parts to my story. The first part is between the ages of, 4 to 18. And then the second part is from ages 19 to where I am now. And the first part kind of covers the issues of bullying and pornography. And then the second part covers a lot of my mental health, suicide, success versus failure, kind of those different topics that I've had to learn, as you mentioned, in the deserts and the really dark places in my life. And something that I've recognized and noticed in my own life is that, we always hear, don't bully others. We always hear, don't use your power to make others feel like you're, challenging them or that you're being condescending. And, we don't like bullies. We hear that all the time. Don't be a bully. We don't like bullies. Yet, at least in my own personal experience, I've never really had someone share with me a time when they got bullied or a time when they went through something like that and it changed the way that they viewed others after it. And so I wanted to be vulnerable with that part of my story. And that's one of the chapters highlights in my book is the chapter is called "What 4 Years of Being Bullied Taught Me." And it highlights,
that's a powerful, we just all to stop right there, listeners. 4 years of being bullied taught me.
Yeah.
Thank you for just being honest with that title. Obviously that takes up me and listeners to, wow, this wasn't just a one-off time at a recess. This is 4 years. It may not have happened every day, but it was part of your life.
Absolutely.
I've learned when it's not happening every day, probably the fear that it will continue to happen, the anxiety it creates at the beginning of the day, even if nothing happens, is part of being bullied. It's just being in that space for that long.
Yeah.
So keep going, Drew.
It was one of the darkest times of my life. And now I can look back with, a lot more compassion and empathy. But obviously anyone who knows or has gone through it or has, a child, a brother, a sister, grandson, anyone who knows someone who's being bullied, it's really difficult in the moment. It's hard to know, what do you do as a parent? It's hard to know, what do you do as, the victim of being bullied? And so I try to shed a little bit of light on that. But, where my story kind of starts in terms of the bullying was, so I grew up with, and I've mentioned on the podcast before, I grew up with a lot of separation anxiety. And we talked about kind of what that is, but it manifested itself in my own life through a lot of kind of homesickness, fear, and panic whenever I'd leave my mom. Whether that was going to preschool, whether that was going to second grade, it would kind of ebb and flow in my life. It would come back for a couple of months and, then it would leave for a year or two, and then it'd come back randomly. And it was something that I wanted to not be a part of me, because it made, creating, friendships and going to school and stuff like that difficult at times. But it was never something that kids used against me to say that I was weak or that I, shouldn't be this way. It was something that was just kind of like, oh, he's sad today, and we're still his friend. And that's kind of why I mention a lot that I still consider Connecticut kind of my home, because it was where I went through difficult times, but I was never really judged for it. And I had a lot of friends and did a lot of fun things, and never had the separation anxiety become so dire that it created emotional gaps in my life that led me down to, different coping mechanisms that weren't healthy in the long run. And so when I was 12, my family, my dad got another job, moved back from Connecticut to Utah. And that's where the chapter gets its title, "What 4 Years of Being Bullied Taught Me." So we moved in the beginning of May 2008. And I was excited. All my family, my extended family was in Utah, cousins, grandparents, aunts, uncles. We'd come out to Utah every other year to visit, and sometimes every summer. And I never had, traumatic emotions associated with Utah. I thought that it was just a great place, and I was excited to make new friends and continue to, just be a kid and have fun. And I finished up 6th grade in Utah, and for about a month in school, I made a lot of friends, was doing a lot of fun things during the summer. And then I went to Lake Tahoe with some friends from Connecticut at the end of August of that year, 2008. And I came back on a Saturday, and the following Monday, I was going to scout camp with kids in my ward. And I just thought, okay, going to scout camp, busy summer. And so we got up there on Monday, and Monday evening, everyone was kind of just roughhousing, just scouts, whatever. And we all went to sleep, and I woke up the next morning and my separation anxiety was back. And not like back, like, oh, I kind of feel weird. Like it was back. Like I was completely panicked. I was homesick. I was fearful, just went to bed without it, woke up with it. And that is where the bullying started, where these kids who I'd gotten to know for a couple of months, but obviously not as well as my friends in Connecticut, who I literally grew up with. And they saw me in this extremely vulnerable state of, just crying and not really knowing what was going on, and not really being able to verbalize how I was feeling in a way that anyone could understand, but just being in a state of just fear and panic and sadness. And that's where it started. That's kind of where the jumping off point was for 4 years of just almost indescribable, just awfulness in my life. But I try to tell it in a way that comes across as if, if we do, bullying in some instances can be preventable, but in other instances, I think it's 70% of elementary school kids are bullied at some point in their lives, whether that's cyberbullying, whether that's, in-person bullying. And so more often than not, people are going to experience it. But for me, I never thought that I would go through it. Never thought that I was one who would be bullied, but it happened and it was there. And so that whole week of scout camp was the separation anxiety mixed with kids telling me, why are you being such a crybaby? Come do the activities with us. I actually share a pretty vulnerable story in the book of some of the kids getting to, telling me to suck it up and then hitting me in the private parts. And that was the first real, no, you don't do that to people. And I never thought that you do that to people. And they did it to me. And I remember just sitting on the gravel next to the ice cream shop at that scout camp, just crying. And they had left. They just were they left me there. And I just was in pain emotionally and physically. And I just kind of got up and walked back to the camp and tried to tell the leaders about it, tried to, like I said, verbalize how I was feeling, but it didn't do much. And so putting that scout camp aside, moving forward, the separation anxiety got to such a rough point that my parents decided to homeschool me for that year, just because they, we just thought school isn't going to work right now, and we need you to learn and we need you to educate yourself. And that ended up being I call it one of my major mistakes, even though, I was 12 and a half. But looking back, obviously, I don't wish it was different, but I completely would have, if I knew what I know now, I would have said, no, you need to go to school, because that's how you're going to get through this in a more effective way, by just going to school and, making it through whatever you need to go through. And you'll make other friends that are outside of your ward, so you don't have to always be bullied by the same kids and different things like that. But so I was homeschooled 7th, 8th, and 9th grade.
Wow.
And that was because of 7th grade was because of the separation anxiety. And then 8th and 9th grade was separation anxiety combined with the bullying. Just because it was so miserable for me to see those kids, because every time I saw them, I was verbally abused, physically punched, thrown on the ground, kicked. I was, told I was fat. I was called Four Eyes. I wore glasses. I was told to go back to Connecticut. We don't want you here. I was called retard and all these different things where that just destroyed me and my self-esteem, my self-confidence. And I would try to, it even got to the point where I hated going to church. I hated church because I associated church with people who were mean like that, because that's what I knew. I knew that these kids who are in, my deacons, teacher quorum, whatever, they're going to be mean to me today. And I don't want to go to church because churches has mean people in it. And so it really took a withdrawal from me to want to go to church because, I was taught growing up that church is a safe place. Church is a place where we feel protected and we feel loved and we feel nurtured. And it was the complete opposite for me. And to my dismay, to my shock, I never once experienced external help from any leaders within any of the quorums, or, any real parental guidance or intervention. I was just kind of told, if they call you retard, call them retard back. If they punch you, you punch them back, just almost show them physically that you can take it, that you can, be the man that they're trying to make you into or something like that, just like
that they're trying to make you into.
Exactly.
It just adds to your trauma.
Yeah. And I talk about it in my story pretty extensively, but, for one reason or another, I never felt that reciprocating in the bullying, in the injustice would heal the issue. And so some people have told me, you should have stepped up for yourself. You should have been stronger. Some people have said, no, you did the right thing by not, really trying to stand up for yourself. And I don't really know what the balance was. I just know what I did. And at the end of the day, when I was 16, I'd been bullied for 4 years. This was pretty much a daily occurrence because I wanted to go out and make friends. So I'd try to hang out with these kids every day and I would just come back emotionally destroyed. But the next day I'd say, okay, maybe today will be different. So I try to go back out the next day and the next day and the next day. But I would try to cope with these emotions, and I would try to cope with this lessened sense of self-worth by viewing pornography. That's kind of where the pornography came in, where I felt like I don't have any connection with anybody. I don't feel needed. I don't feel wanted. So I'm going to turn to this platform that makes me feel those things, however short-timed it may be. And so I view pornography, almost on a daily basis for 5-10 minutes, whatever it was, because it was the one part of my day where I felt that sense of connection. And looking back now, obviously it wasn't connection. It was just momentary pleasure that my brain saw as connection and said, okay, you got your fill, move on. And that's kind of where the story goes until I was 16. So it was I'll get to the lessons learned in a little bit. That's kind of the gist of it thus far.
Every time you come and do a podcast, Drew, my heart just kind of gets big, and because your courage to talk about this, and I just admire you that you didn't lock this up inside of you and said, that was the past. I'm in a different place now. I'm not going to talk about this. It takes a lot of courage to talk about all the things you're talking about.
Thank you.
I think it's a great sign of strength. It's a character attribute we don't value enough in males. Maybe females are used to being a little more vulnerable because their culture allows it. But I think being vulnerable and talking about it heals and brings hope to others that are on that. I hope you caught, listeners, that you knew exactly where you were. You were sitting on gravel by an ice cream thing. Mm-hmm. That visual imagery is permanently embedded in your brain. I don't know if you can still see the color of the gravel.
Oh, yeah.
The color of the ice cream.
It's there.
But, that's a long time ago. And for that to be permanently embedded in your brain, to me, just as a sign of the trauma you experienced. And that there were not people, adults in your life that were safe to sort of deal with that.
Yeah.
Um, Talk about what you wish adults did for you and what kind of training we gave adults so that they would be allies to you and be on your side.
Yeah. And this is something that I've given a lot of thought to myself because for me, it was natural to ask for help when I was kind of going through these tough times. Obviously for the first month or two, I just thought, oh, this is just a phase, this will pass. This isn't how, kids treat each other. Kids are supposed to be nice to each other. And so I thought, oh, these are just kind of like anomalies, just kind of a one-time thing. But when it started becoming more severe, that's where I sought like intervention from parents and leaders. Cause the leaders were, I mean, in a sense, the kids would wait till the leaders went around the corner and then they'd punch me or hit me or call me names, whatever. But the leaders saw it sometimes, and yet there was never intervention in the way that would have put an end to the problem. And even from my parents, even though I knew that they loved me and cared about me, there was never intervention that got to the point where they called somebody or they did something. It was always just the kind of, stand up for yourself. Don't let them treat you that way. And stuff that sounded great, but wasn't actually effective. And so for leaders and parents, it all comes down to just being self-aware enough to know who is under your stewardship. And, whether that's your own child, whether that's, um, you know, someone in your quorum or someone in your group or your class, if you're a teacher or something like that, you got to know your students, you got to know your kids, you got to know your quorum members. And you need to be aware of what's going on inside of the realm, the environment that you're in, because when it comes down to a 12 or 13-year-old or sometimes even younger, they don't have all the emotional skills that you have. They don't have all of the verbal skills or the physical skills that you have, and they don't really know how to handle situations like that, which is why I turned to pornography, because I didn't know any other way to cope with it. I didn't know that this was something that could be stopped. I just thought it'll go until either I move or they move or something happens. And so for those who are in a stewardship role and that maybe have an idea that something is happening or maybe see something, you just got to go over to the kid and create a safe place for them to talk about it. And not a safe place as in you sit them down, you say, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm okay." "Okay, great." Because most kids will just say, "Yeah, I'm fine. I don't want to bring adults into the situation because that could make it worse, or the bullying could, you know, get stronger or something like that." But at the end of the day, it's the adult's responsibility to watch out for people that are, more vulnerable than they are. And so whether that means, just having a better eye on things, whether that means, standing up the first day of class or the first day of church or, the first lesson or something and saying, you know what, we're going to have a vulnerable conversation today. We all know kids, we all know people who, are bullied or that experience bullying. And that's not going to be tolerated here because this is going to be a safe place. This is going to be a place where you look forward to coming to every day, every week, every month, etc. And if I see that, there's going to be consequences because you may think to yourself, "Oh, we're just having fun. We're just being kids. We're just pushing each other around." But you have no idea how that other person sees it. You have no idea how the person on the reciprocating end of your words or your actions perceives what you're trying to do. And so that's not going to be tolerated. And you guys can go play football, you guys can go wrestle, you can do whatever you want to do. But in this class or in this environment, we're going to be kind to each other. We're going to encourage each other. We're going to uplift each other. And, I think that can go a long way because most of the time I was never taught a lesson growing up in deacons, teachers, priest quorum, and, in any school setting. I was never once taught, you know, a lesson that was vulnerable and straightforward about not bullying others. It was either just, we're not mean to each other here, and then moving on. There was nothing that was really effective or powerful to those who we're going to be in that vulnerable state. And so I would just say to be open, be honest about it with people under your stewardship. And if someone comes to you, show an actual interest. Make sure that they know that you are on their side, that if something happens that you need to put a stop to, it will stop, because that can provide a safe place for a lot of kids. And, my extent of it to the pornography was, obviously the pornography wasn't something that was, kind of a soft withdrawal. It wasn't something that was just kind of like, it's not that bad. A lot of kids get to the point where they take their own life, or they overdose on drugs, or they do something that has repercussions that can end with a lot of pain for a lot of people. And so you never know what, happens because of unkindness or bullying. And so just to have that relationship with the kids or with the neighbors or something where you can just be aware and go over and ask them can make a big difference.
To talk about, have you reconciled with any of these guys, or not? And if just talk about, and I'm not implying you need to.
Yeah.
Sometimes in toxic relationships, the best thing is just to not have relationships with people that are toxic in your life, including leaders. If leaders, you feel that way, just talk a little bit about any relationship you have with any of these people at this point in your life.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. So when I was 16, we ended up moving away from that neighborhood, that ward, that area. And so kind of from that point on, I distanced myself emotionally as well as physically from these people.
And I think that's a sign of strength.
Yeah. I wasn't plotting their doom in my bedroom or, gonna go toilet paper or egg their car or their house or something. I was just kind of like, thank goodness I'm away from that scenario. And so, one of the kids, so there were about, I'd say between 5 or 10 kids at any given time that were actively treating me unkindly. And one of them actually quite sadly died by suicide.
Wow.
He was going through stuff that nobody knew about and taking it out on others. And then one day he was gone. And I actually went to his funeral with another friend and, just kind of said, I'm sorry that you felt this way and no one knew. And, just kind of paid my respects and moved forward. And, there was another kid who tried to take his own life and didn't succeed, but kind of had some pretty strong physical repercussions from that. And, there are some other kids who have gone on to serve missions and get married and have kids like nothing, ever happened. And to this day, I don't hold any grudges. To this day, I don't wish ill on any of them. And to this day, I don't need to see any of them ever again. And to this day, none of them have ever reached out to me with an apology or, hey, I was thinking about, what I did when I was younger. Did that affect you? I've never heard any of that, and I don't expect to or need to. I've just kind of put up a big boundary that has basically said, I'm not going to tolerate this in my life anymore. If I see it being done to someone else, I'm going to step up immediately. If it's being done to me, I'm going to step up immediately. And that's kind of just where my point of view is now in life.
A lot of great principles there. If I'm going to ask you a few questions, if one of those friends heard this podcast and wanted to reach out, would that be a good idea or a bad idea? And it's maybe you answering that question. There may be people listening that have hurt others, that have been bullies, and maybe not your direct bully, but just others, and wondering, is it best for me to just let it be and move forward? Or would it be healing for the person I bullied to actually reach out and apologize? And I would guess everybody's, it's going to be a different
Yeah.
situation for everybody. But any general advice, just from your perspective, when you think about, would it be helpful or not helpful?
That's a great thought. So something that I've learned about forgiveness is that it's more about you being the forgiver than the person asking for forgiveness, if that makes sense.
It does.
So we're the ones that hold the key. And when we choose to forgive others, we're, in a sense, unlocking ourselves from the jail from the inside. And so I've never been one to, of course, I've felt the pain and the trauma from that, lasted years in my life. But it never got to the point where I just wanted bad things to happen to them. But that being said, there may be some listening to this podcast who experience, far worse bullying than me, or, not as bad bullying than me, but they themselves felt like they had years of their life taken from them or something like that. And they may hold on to it, 10, 20, 30 years later. And coming from someone who has personal experience, I can't just say, forgive and forget, because that shows an insane lack of compassion for those who have been through it. But what I can say is, if you're still holding on to those feelings of, rage or just angst or, just anger towards people who treated you unfairly, however long ago it may have been, but just open up the possibility for forgiveness. You don't have to forgive today, but just allow yourself to think about it in a way where it's a possibility. Because one day you may listen to something or read something or have a conversation with somebody, and it may just click in your brain like, it's time now. And everyone's time to forgive is different. But if someone is listening to this who has bullied somebody and thinks to themselves, oh, maybe I should reach out and try and make amends, of course you can do that. The way that the person responds is going to be up to them. So if you reach out to someone you bullied and in vulnerability say, I'm really sorry for what I did, and I recognize that it's wrong, and I'm sorry that it's 5 or 10 years later, but I just had to call you or text you and say I apologize. If the person who receives that text or that call says, I don't want to talk to you, don't call this number ever again, then you got it off your chest and you did the right thing for you, and you should move on. If they respond, kindly and say, thank you so much for calling, that means so much to me, then you just created a friendship that may last for years to come, and you bridge that gap. So just going back to that, open up the possibility for forgiveness if you've been treated unfairly or unkindly. And then if you happen to reach out to somebody and they accept it, great. If they don't, then you did your part to take care of what you needed to.
These are great off the cuff, on the fly answers, Drew. And it's one of your gifts is answering complex questions with principles that allow people to process that the best way for them. I think if you're the bully and someone responds where they don't want to talk to you, don't make it about you and that now you've been a victim. You've got to not do that. It's still about the person that you were unkind to, you bullied, and you've got to keep that in perspective, that person is creating a boundary and you need to honor that boundary and not somehow turn this now that you're the victim here. Keep the big picture in place of what you're trying to do here, and you're trying to repent, and not because it's helping you. It probably would help you, but I think the heart you need to have is, I actually want to lift somebody's burden, that I created tremendous burden. I'm coming this from a place of love to help somebody else. And I think messages are the best way to sort of open the door to introduction, because then the person who's been bullied can kind of process that. Yeah. And it's maybe very triggering for them to see your name on their phone or in a DM or however you want to reach out to them. And it may just take some time, but it is possible. And Drew actually put his hands together to visualize what could happen in these relationships, because sometimes these relationships that have so much pain, if you can get through that and heal them, the vulnerability of going through that creates a really wonderful relationship going forward, and some of the most healing relationships for both parties.
Again.
Um,
Absolutely.
but it's back to, if it's a toxic relationship, the person that's been bullied needs to feel permission,
Hmm.
and they don't that to separate themselves from the bully. That's not a sign of weakness. That's not a sign of not living the gospel. It's not the sign of not being Christ-like. It's just a sign of way you survive.
Hmm.
And I think your heavenly parents are grateful when you do things to create boundaries from people in your life that are unhelpful to you in your life. Hurt people hurt people. So when you talked about this bully who ended up dying by suicide, you had some empathy for him,
Hmm.
and you even went. And I think on some level you recognize that whatever was going on in his life, some sort of pain way down there was manifest towards you. And it doesn't excuse it, but I think we have to realize that if you've got a kid that's a bully, or somebody in your quorum that's a bully, or someone you know it's a bully, there may be something deeper there that they need a therapist or a trusted adult or somebody to address. And that's going to help the kid in the long time and the people that kid is hurting.
Hmm.
Now, I think of common enemy intimacy, that phrase from Brene Brown. Common enemy intimacy is the opposite of true belonging. If the bond we share is simply we hate the same people, the intimacy we experience is intense. However, it's not a fuel for real connection. And I'm paraphrasing her quote, but so it's possible some of the bullying towards you is just all the other guys just enjoyed the connection they got,
Oh, absolutely.
and they weren't, and maybe not all of them had deep hurt. They just enjoyed connecting. Instead of connecting in a way to lift others, they were connecting in a way to bully you.
Yeah.
And somehow that was creating a feeling of belonging for them.
Hmm.
And that's not the higher, holier law that Christ teaches. And sometimes, they're not coming from a position of hurt. I love that you're honest. Any thoughts on that before we move on?
No, I think that's great. Yeah, like you said, hurt people hurt people. It's one of the greatest, phrases that I've come to recognize. And it doesn't excuse their behavior in the slightest. But what it does is it opens up for you like I was talking about earlier, the possibility to just kind of understand that, you think about, the Savior and how he was bullied. And that's even, that's a weak word for what he experienced, but the injustice and the unfairness and the cruelty that he experienced, he recognized that when he was on the cross, and he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And you may think, as a victim of being bullied, you may think, "Oh, well, of course they know what they're doing. They're being mean to me. They're hitting me. They're verbally abusing me." And it can happen in a marriage. It can happen in a family. It can happen between siblings. It can happen in any situation where there are people involved. Bullying can be an issue. But at the end of the day, you can't change people. But what you can do is you yourself can understand there may be something deeper going on. There probably is. And it becomes your responsibility to recognize, and this may take professional help from, a licensed therapist or something, but it becomes your responsibility to recognize, okay, this is where I draw the line. And it can be difficult, especially within church settings, because we're always told, families are forever. So if there's a situation where you're being bullied within a family, that can make it even more difficult, because you may feel like you have to reconcile. You may have to be kind always. You may, feel like, oh, I can't put up a boundary if it's, my sister or my dad or my husband or my wife, whatever. But there comes a point where, it becomes the responsibility of the person who's receiving the bullying to say, this is where I draw the line, and there needs to be a boundary here, or there needs to be professional intervention, or I need to tell somebody about this. And, if I may, can I share a personal experience? So someone very close to me has a family member who we characterize as toxic, in the sense of just very unkind, very self-centered at times, and just has a lot of hatred towards this particular person. For whatever reason, we don't know the specifics, but it comes out in, snark comments. It comes out in exclusion from, activities, different things like that. And it really used to mess with the psyche, the emotions of the person who received it, the person that I'm close to. But what this person has done is recognize that, you know what, as difficult as this may be, and however indoctrinated I've been to the, families are forever, there comes a point where my own mental health and my own mental safety takes precedence over, this idea that I have to be with this person forever. And that's obviously a fine line that you have to walk. But this person has recognized that this is not a safe place for them. This relationship isn't a safe situation. And if this person wants to reconcile to them with an apology or something, then great. But if not, then it just needs to be, there needs to be distance, both emotionally and physically, and there needs to be time to heal. And so I just wanted to add that in there just in case there's a family situation going on.
I think sometimes I love that. And sometimes we look at scriptures and we turn the other cheek. I think that's symbolic of just trying to your best in a relationship. But if it's a toxic relationship, we need to do what Drew did. Drew's reminding me of my past here. I don't want to make this podcast to me. I've mentioned a couple times in this podcast, I've seen a therapist twice in my life. And one was serving as a YSA bishop when I just got emotionally drained and I just needed somebody to sort of deal with my emotional fatigue. And I think I've mentioned here that then she had incredible insights, as I sometimes would take a YSA situation without a name to her, and sort of my understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ plus her therapy insights often really helped me help a YSA. I wish every bishop could have a therapist sort of walking with them or be trained as a social worker, because it certainly helped me. But I did see a therapist in elementary school, and I was having a hard time fitting in and really connecting with my friend group. I went to Indian Hills in elementary school in Salt Lake City and Bonneville Junior High, and I wasn't being bullied like you. I enjoyed scout camp. I enjoyed church was a safe place for me. So I don't want to compare experiences mine, but I was not fitting in with the group, and I was withdrawn. I've learned I'm a little bit of an introvert and enjoy being alone. And it's probably why my parents had me go to a therapist to understand why I was kind of separating myself and my friends. But then the point of this story is I want to tell you about Steve Jensen. I've never talked about Steve Jensen on the podcast. Steve was the coolest guy at Indian Hills and the coolest guy at Bonneville Junior High. And he knew I was struggling. And he was always in charge of picking the flag football team. And somehow he figured out I wasn't very big, but I had great hands. and he would take me off to the side and help me learn to catch the football. And then he'd call me on his football team. And I don't know of anybody that's had a bigger impact of my life through high school. Adults are really helpful, but Steve Jensen, the coolest guy. And it wasn't very complicated what he did. He just saw me and saw somebody that was just a little bit on the fringe and found something that I could do and just helped me feel included. And I didn't, he saved me in so many ways. And be the Steve Jensen. Teach your kids to be the Steve Jensen. He's a dentist here in Salt Lake. If any of you know him, please tell him how much I appreciate him and all he's done for me. And I'll never know what he did for me in those years. Talk about church, and here you're honest with church became this non-safe place for you. How did you not lose your testimony to church? And why did you then find a way to stay in the church when you're having these difficult experiences?
Well, I also want to echo gratitude to Steve Jensen for what he did for you. It's, the impact is, you don't even recognize what it was, but you knew that what he did for you was incalculable. So kudos to Steve. But yeah, church was tough. I don't really know what the deciding factor was in me, not outright rebelling or, doing something that, more permanently revoked my testimony or something like that. But I really even though I was viewing pornography during that time, I recognized that God still loved me, and that even though members of the church weren't represented who he was, he still loved me, he still cared about me, and that he would make it right eventually. And
how did you learn everything you just said?
I don't know. I just kind of felt it inside. And it was something that even growing up has always been a part of me, where even when I was, viewing pornography or doing other things that were detrimental to my emotional and psychological and spiritual health, I would always turn to God after and just say, I'm sorry, I recognize that I did something wrong, and I'm going to try and stop, or I'm going to try and do something differently. And so it was never my intention to actively rebel against God, even though I wasn't doing necessarily the things that I knew would make him happy or, proud. But at the end of the day, I always just kind of went back to him. And I think I learned that because I recognized that adults and other people around me, kids my age, they couldn't do what I needed them to do to take care of me, or help me feel safe. And so I would retreat to that spiritual space that helped me feel safe, even for a moment. And looking back now, the beauty of perspective is, 13 years later in my life, I knew that God wanted to take me out of that situation. He didn't like seeing me there. He didn't like seeing me being hurt like that daily. But he knew that, 13 years later, that I'd have these experiences to share and be able to help others. And I thank him for that. And I never thought that I would thank him for that or be grateful for what I went through. But I still remember when I was 16, it was the end of the day, just came back from junior year of high school, and went upstairs to my bathroom, and I closed the door and I looked in the mirror. And I think I've shared this on the podcast before, but it was the turning point in my life that I still remember clearly. And I looked in the mirror and I said, I will try to never be unkind to people because I never want someone to feel the way I felt. And from 16 to now, I've kept that one of the strongest mottos in my life, where I've never intentionally tried to be mean to anybody. And of course, there's been times where I may have, been unkind in their eyes, and I tried to recognize that and apologize. But that's why the chapter is what 4 years of being bullied taught me, because the end of the chapter comes back to, I never want anyone to feel the way I felt, so I'm going to try and treat people with kindness. And so going back to the question that you asked about church, was I just trusted in God that he would help me through one way or another. And my testimony has nothing to do with people around me. At the end of the day, it's all about your relationship with God and Jesus. That really matters. And so, again, you need to recognize and be aware of if you need to get yourself out of the situation. But being with Jesus, being with God, is what helped me make it through and learn the lessons I needed to.
I love the way you navigated that. I call it church-generated pain, or where the church becomes unsafe, and your ability to separate the institutional church, the people, your quorum, from the gospel of Jesus Christ. And often we don't really teach that, but often Latter-day Saints that are able to stay in the church are able to separate those two, and it gives them a framework to stay in the church, even if they've had really painful experiences from whatever source in the church, a leader, a member, a core member. And that's a lot. there's a lot of that going around, and I've learned to hear those stories and sit with people, and those are complicated stories when you turn to your faith community to sort of be the healing place for you as you're dealing with couples difficult stuff, and it was the source of the difficult stuff.
Yeah.
If all the difficult stuff was happening and you could turn to this one balm of Gilead to be healed, which is often what we're able to do, but if that becomes not a safe place for you, you've had to work hard and receive a lot of support from your heavenly parents and the Savior and the atonement to heal you, and it's giving you the ability to stay in and be a voice of support. I can't remember if I mentioned the right junior high. Now that I'm thinking back, I can't remember if I said Bonneville or Hillside.
You
listeners.
said Bonneville.
I didn't go to Bonneville. Our kids went to Bonneville. I went to Hillside Junior High. So just to set the record straight, it doesn't matter. I went to Indian Hills. I'm sure of that. I went to Hillside Junior High, and I went to Highland High School, and things gradually got better for me, especially in the high school level. I love the way you just talk about how porn use came into your life. And I like the word use. And it's a softer language to describe it. And I know I've shared this, listeners, if you've heard this story before, but the therapist that I went to as a YSA bishop taught me the iceberg principle. It was the very best ministering principle anybody's ever taught me. Is often what I'm seeing as a YSA bishop, what they're talking about is not what I should really be taught. It's the bottom of the iceberg to help me understand. So if I'm thinking back to you, if you were 16 or 17 and opened up to your bishop about porn use, and it would take a lot of discipline for a bishop to say, okay, I want to know the big story here. I don't want to just talk about porn. I don't want to give you 7 steps to end porn.
Mm-hmm.
There may be something bigger going on here that is a chance for me as your priesthood leader, as you vulnerably opened up about porn use, to actually understand the bigger picture here and truly lift your burden and truly help you versus potentially create a lot of shame for you, how I handle this vulnerable. Drew and I both are teaching that porn's a sin. No one's de-sinning porn.
Yes.
But, I just admire you the way you're talking about that in a way that destigmatizes it without sort of making it okay.
Yeah.
And I really think Satan's greatest tool with porn is the shame and the self-loathing and the isolation and the lack of authentic connection it can create. And so I'd love you to talk more about that. And I know that's part of your book for those that need hope to solve porn.
Yeah. I mean, I used to, have the same philosophy towards porn that a lot of people do, is like, you don't talk about it. You don't bring it into the open because that somehow, applauds what it does, or that somehow makes it so that more people want to view it if you talk about it out loud. But in the reality of it is, when you're vulnerable with pornography and vulnerable about why you viewed it and what you learned from it, you open up the path for so many other people to heal from it as well. Because whether we want to recognize it or not, our kids are being exposed to it. I think the age is like 9 years and younger now is the first exposure to pornography, whether deliberately or through, external circumstances. And you're right. I talk about use because I used to say addicted, and I've learned that there's a very strong difference between habitual use of pornography and addiction. When you're addicted to pornography, you can't function properly as a human being. You can't do school, you can't do work, your relationships are falling apart. You're consumed by it. It's not just something that you kind of use as a buffer. It's something that is all consuming in your life. For those that are just trying to escape a negative emotion like anger, sadness, or loneliness, or fatigue, and they turn to pornography, that's habitual use, because you've trained your brain to habitually desire pornography when you're feeling a negative emotion. And instead of feeling that negative emotion, you want to just cover it up, which helps for the time being, but doesn't solve the problem at all. And so I mentioned this to you off air, but I do personal coaching now. And one of the things that I help coach people on is solving their pornography use.
Good.
Especially junior high, high school students. And but really anyone of any age. And the first thing I try to help them understand is, don't say that you're addicted. Say that, you have this challenge with pornography and that you're going to be able to solve it through retraining your brain. Because if we can retrain our brain to, overcome another negative habit, then we can retrain our brain to overcome pornography use. And even though it's shamed in our culture at times, I'm here to tell you that I don't judge you. I don't look at you any differently. Both and I know that it's a sin, and we're not going to, dance around that. But at the end of the day, we're going to focus on, what your triggers are and how we can retrain your brain to overcome those triggers when you feel tempted.
How do people contact you if they want your help?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook, send me a Facebook message, or Instagram. Mr. Drew B. Young is my username. You can send me a message there, and I'll do my best to help you.
And we'll link to Drew's Facebook and Instagram in the podcast description, so you can scroll down the podcast description and find it. Anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I'm grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Tell our listeners the name of your book again, and just so anybody and everybody can find it.
Stand Guard at the Door of Your Mind. So it's to help you out when you're facing challenges that have to do with any mindset. So
tell our listeners how old you are.
25.
I tease Drew about his age because I just recognize his life experiences at 25 has stretched him to be in a position where he's uniquely qualified to help people. Now, the quote I read at the beginning of the podcast that I botched, I'm going to read again because I've got it in front of me and my brain's working a little bit better. You've heard it a lot, and a lot of people actually message me and want a reference to this quote. But it's by Henry Norn, a Catholic priest, in the book Wounded Healer. And my friend Jake Watts is the first one that got me on this. So thanks, Jake. Norwin wrote, quote, that a minister's service will not be perceived as authentic unless it comes from a heart wounded by the suffering about which he or she speaks. The great illusion of leadership is to think others can be led out of the desert by someone who's been there, someone who's never been there, end quote. And so I'm grateful for Drew Young, who, through no fault of his own, got in some really difficult deserts, really because of the choices of others. And he is now giving hope to people that are in those deserts. And hopefully, listeners, we are doing a better job of not creating deserts for other people that they don't need to be created. No one's earth plan, I believe, is to be a victim of bullying. That is not in the plan. That is part of the plan, I guess, when it comes to people's choices. But I like what Drew said, that he'd never been in a class where we talked about not bullying. And I think that's something from an educational perspective as parents and local leaders, we should start teaching at a pretty young age. And when we say, these talks, this is love thy neighbor as thyself, I think then we can go and say, okay, here's how we address not bullying and how Christ would treat people. Mm-hmm. So, you've got a great life ahead of you healing other people. It's part of your life ministry. And
thank you.
I think as a father and a husband and a grandfather in 20 plus years, this will be continued part of your life ministry, and it'll become a legacy in your family and create a culture that some of, I think, of your paydays will see how your work has blessed the lives of your kids and people around you and even grandkids. And really admire you we didn't talk much about suicide. We've talked about that, but I'm glad you didn't choose suicide. I recognize that was a logical option facing you and with the difficult things. And in our ward training today, a clinical worker talked about, and I just remind this to our listeners, and Drew would share the same thing, I think, is just it's okay to ask somebody if they're suicidal. Even if they say no, it creates a feeling that you're a safe person for them. It doesn't introduce the idea in their mind. They don't suddenly become suicidal if we talk about that. So I think it's okay to create a family culture where that word suicide is part of the family culture. Because if you've got a kid that's suicidal, they need to know that you as parents are safe to talk about that because you're talking about that in your home or a local leader or a friend.
Absolutely.
So normalize talking about suicide to me helps people not die by suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you need to go one step further. Could you hurt yourself? Because I think that means that you might just be able to tell them, yeah, I could hurt myself. But if you ask somebody if they're suicidal and then even say, okay, do you have a plan? Tell me your
Mm-hmm.
plan. I think that creates a feeling that you can go all the way where they need someone to go and have the kind of conversation they really want to have, but just don't know who to have that with and if you're a safe person. So I don't know if you want to add it to that,
No,
Drew.
that's you. Yeah, you said that so beautifully. Both you and I are here for people whenever they may need a safe place to go, and I'm grateful for the opportunities that I've had to be able to help people now in a more intimate, compassionate, empathetic setting. So, thank you for the platform, my friend.
And if you just want to feel uplifted in life, go be on Drew's Facebook, be on his Instagram. It's just, Elder Renlund talks about stone throwers and stone catchers, and Drew's a stone catcher. And if you want to reduce divisiveness in your life and feel hope, please connect with Drew and the great work he's doing. So this is Drew Young and Richard Ostler signing off on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.